Hello everyone. Welcome back to our class on Agri-Economics and Farm Management. Today, we're diving into Unit 2, where we'll explore some fundamental concepts of economics that are super important for understanding how our agricultural systems work. In this unit, we'll be looking at ideas like goods, utility, value, price, wealth, production, consumption, equilibrium, and margin. These might sound like big words, but don't worry. We'll break them down together, and I'll try to use lots of examples from our everyday lives and from farming here in Nepal to make things clear. So, let's get started with our first topic, goods. What are goods? Well, imagine you're at your local market. You see rice, dal, vegetables, maybe some farming tools. All these things that can satisfy our wants or needs are called goods. They can be things we eat, like rice and dal, or things we use, like seeds and fertilizers. Goods are basically anything that helps meet our needs or make our lives better. Alright, let's dig deeper into what goods really are. So, goods are essentially anything that can satisfy human wants or needs. They can be commodities like rice, wheat, or corn, or they can be services like tractor rental or agricultural advice. The important thing is that goods are the starting point of all economic activity. Without goods, there's nothing to buy, sell, or use. Now, goods have a few key characteristics. First, they're tangible, which means you can touch and feel them. Think about a sack of rice or a bottle of milk. Second, goods are the material outcome of production. This means that someone or something has to produce them. For example, farmers grow crops, and factories make fertilizers. Let me give you a quick example. Imagine a farmer in the Terai region planting wheat. The seeds they use, the fertilizer they apply, and finally the wheat they harvest. All of these are goods. The seeds and fertilizer are used in production, and the wheat is the final product that satisfies the need for food. Okay, so now that we know what goods are, let's talk about how we can classify them. There are different ways to categorize goods, and this helps us understand their role in the economy better. First, we can classify goods based on supply. There are free goods and economic goods. Free goods are those that are abundant in nature and don't require payment. Think about air, sunlight, or rainwater. These are gifts from nature that we can use without paying. But economic goods are different. They're limited and scarce, which means we have to pay for them. Most of the things we use in farming, like tractors, seeds, and irrigation water, are economic goods. Let me ask you a question. Have you ever noticed that in some villages, there's plenty of water in the rivers during the monsoon, but it's scarce in the summer? That's a perfect example of how water can be a free good during the monsoon but becomes an economic good in the summer when it's scarce and people might have to pay to get it from other sources. Let's move on to another way of classifying goods, based on consumption. We have consumer goods and producer goods. Consumer goods are those that give direct satisfaction to people. These are things we use every day, like food, clothes, and shelter. For example, when you eat a plate of dal bhat, the dal and rice are consumer goods because they directly satisfy your hunger. On the other hand, producer goods are used to produce other goods. They give satisfaction indirectly by helping to make the final product. Think about a tractor. A tractor itself isn't something you consume directly, but it's used to plow fields and produce crops, which then become consumer goods. So, producer goods are like the tools and equipment that help in the production process. Let me share a quick story. There was a farmer in my village who bought a new plow. The plow was a producer good because it helped him prepare his field faster and more efficiently. As a result, he was able to grow more rice, which became a consumer good for his family and to sell in the market. Now, let's talk about classifying goods based on durability. We have two categories here, mono-period goods and poly-period goods. Mono-period goods are those that can be used only once in the production and consumption process. Think about seeds. Once you plant them, they're used up in that one growing season. Similarly, when you eat a banana, it's consumed in one go. Poly-period goods, on the other hand, can be used repeatedly over several periods. A motorcycle is a good example. You can use it for many years, and it helps in transporting goods from one place to another. Another example is a refrigerator, which you use daily to keep your food fresh. Let me ask you another question. Have you noticed how some tools in your house or on the farm last for many years, while others get used up quickly? That's the difference between poly-period and mono-period goods. The durable ones, like a tractor or a storage shed, are poly-period goods because they assist in production over multiple seasons. Alright, let's explore one last way of classifying goods, based on transferability. This can get a bit complex, but I'll try to simplify it. Transferability refers to how easily a good can be moved from one person to another or from one place to another. External material transferable goods are things like land. You can buy and sell land, transferring ownership from one person to another. External material non-transferable goods are items like your PAN card. It's tied to you personally and can't be transferred to someone else. Then we have external non-material transferable goods, such as goodwill. This is a bit abstract, but think of it as the reputation or positive image of a business that can be transferred when the business is sold. External non-material non-transferable goods are things like light. You can't really transfer light from one person to another. Finally, internal non-material non-transferable goods are emotions like love or cruelty. These are personal feelings that can't be physically transferred. Let me give you a quick example related to farming. Imagine a farmer who has a piece of land, external material transferable. He can sell it to another farmer. But his PAN card, external material non-transferable, stays with him. The reputation he has built in his village for growing quality crops is like goodwill, external non-material transferable, which might make his farm more valuable if he ever sells it. And the passion he has for farming, internal non-material non-transferable, is something that drives him personally. Okay, let's move on to the next big concept, utility. Utility is all about the ability of something to satisfy needs or wants. It's the usefulness of a good or service. For example, when you're hungry, food has utility because it satisfies your hunger. When your tractor breaks down, a repair service has utility because it gets your tractor working again. But here's the interesting thing, utility is subjective. What's useful to one person might not be useful to another. Let's say you have a pen. For a student or a writer, that pen has high utility because they use it to write notes or stories. But for someone who can't read or write, the same pen might have zero utility. Let me share a quick story. There was a farmer who had an old radio. For him, that radio had high utility because it provided weather updates and news about crop prices. His neighbor, who had a smartphone, found the radio less useful because he got his information online. So, the utility of the radio varied between the two farmers based on their needs and circumstances. Alright, let's dive into the characteristics of utility. First, utility is subjective. As I mentioned earlier, it varies from person to person. For example, during planting season, a farmer might find seeds extremely useful, but after the harvest, their utility might decrease because the immediate need is met. Second, utility can change with time. Think about a cow. During the parturition, that's when the cow is about to give birth. The farmer needs to pay extra attention and care. The utility of having veterinary supplies and knowledge is high at that time. But during the dry season when the cow isn't pregnant, the same supplies might not be as urgently needed. Third, utility can vary with purpose. Take water, for instance. It can be used for drinking, cleaning, or irrigation. Each purpose gives water a different kind of utility. For a household, drinking water is essential. For a farm, irrigation water is crucial for crop growth. Fourth, utility can be greater when you own something rather than when you hire it. Owning a tractor gives a farmer more utility because they can use it whenever they want, whereas hiring a tractor means they have to pay each time and can't use it as freely. Let me ask you a question. Have you ever noticed that when you borrow something, like a tool from a neighbor, you're careful with it and return it quickly? But when you own that tool, you might use it more often and feel more satisfied because it's yours? That's the difference in utility between owning and hiring. Now, let's explore the different types of utility. First, there's form utility. This happens when the form of a good is changed to make it more useful. For example, processing paddy into rice. The rice is more directly usable than paddy, so it has higher utility. Another example is turning milk into cheese. The cheese has a different form and can be stored longer, giving it higher utility for some purposes. Then we have place utility. This is created by moving goods from a place where they're abundant to a place where they're needed. Think about tea from Ilam. The tea gardens in Ilam produce lots of tea, but people all over Nepal want to drink it. By transporting the tea to Kathmandu, Pokhara, and other cities, we create place utility because the tea becomes available where consumers are. Time utility is about making goods available when they're needed. For example, storing rice during the harvest season and selling it during the off-season when rice is scarce. This ensures that people have access to rice throughout the year, not just when it's harvested. Possession utility comes from owning a good. When you buy land and use it for agricultural farming, you gain possession utility. You can decide what to grow and how to manage the land. If you were just renting the land, your possession utility would be lower because you don't have full control over it. Alright, let's talk about two ways of measuring utility, cardinal and ordinal. Cardinal utility is the idea that we can measure utility in exact numbers, like utils. For example, you might say that eating an apple gives you 10 utils of satisfaction, while eating a banana gives you 15 utils. This allows you to compare the satisfaction from different goods quantitatively, but some economists argue that it's hard to measure utility so precisely. Instead, they use the concept of ordinal utility, which is about ranking preferences. You might say that you prefer bananas to apples, but you can't exactly quantify how much more satisfaction you get from one versus the other. You just know your order of preference. There are also two important concepts related to utility: total utility and marginal utility. Total utility is the overall satisfaction you get from consuming a certain quantity of a good. For example, if you eat 3 apples, the total utility would be the sum of the satisfaction from each apple. Marginal utility, on the other hand, is the additional satisfaction you get from consuming one more unit of a good. So, the third apple you eat gives you some extra satisfaction, but probably less than the first apple because you're getting full. This leads us to an important principle in economics: the law of diminishing marginal utility. As you consume more of a good, the additional satisfaction from each extra unit tends to decrease. Let me give you a quick example. Imagine you're really hungry and you start eating momos. The first momo gives you a lot of satisfaction. The second momo is also good, but maybe not as satisfying as the first. By the fifth momo, you might be feeling full, and the marginal utility of that fifth momo is much lower than the first one. Okay, let's move on to the concept of value. In economics, value usually refers to value in exchange. This means that a good has value if it can be exchanged for other goods or for money. Unlike free goods, which only have value in use, like air or sunlight, economic goods have value because they can be traded. For a good to have value, it must have a few characteristics. First, it must have utility. If something can't satisfy a want or need, it's not valuable in an economic sense. Second, it must be scarce. If there's too much of something, like stones in a rocky field, it might not have much value because it's not limited. Third, it must be transferable and marketable. This means it can be bought and sold in a market. Let me share a quick story. There's a village where a particular type of soil is very fertile and good for growing vegetables. Because this soil is limited and can be used to grow valuable crops, it has economic value. Farmers can sell vegetables grown in this soil at a higher price. But if there were too much of this soil, it might not be as valuable because it's not scarce anymore. Alright, let's talk about price. Price is essentially the value of a good expressed in monetary terms. In the old days, before money existed, people used the barter system. They would exchange goods directly, like swapping rice for cloth. In those times, value and price were the same thing because everything was traded for other goods. But today, we use money as a medium of exchange. So, the price of a good tells us how much money we need to give up to get that good. For example, if a kilo of rice costs 100 rupees, that's its price. Price helps us compare the value of different goods. It tells producers how much they can earn by selling their products and helps consumers decide what they can afford. Let me ask you a question. Have you ever been to a local market and noticed how prices can vary? Sometimes, the same vegetable might be cheaper in one stall and more expensive in another. This is because price is influenced by many factors like supply, demand, and the cost of production. When there's a good harvest, prices might drop because there's more supply. But if there's a shortage, prices can go up. Now, let's explore the concept of wealth. Wealth refers to anything that has value and can satisfy human wants. It includes all the goods and resources that we can use to meet our needs and wants. Wealth isn't just about money, it's about all the valuable things we possess. For something to be considered wealth, it must have a few characteristics. First, it should have utility. It must be able to satisfy a want or need. Second, it must be scarce. If something is too abundant, like air, it might not be considered wealth. Third, it must be transferable, meaning it can be bought and sold. Fourth, it must be external to a person. Things that are part of us, like our labor, aren't considered wealth in this sense. Let me give you a quick example. A farmer's wealth includes his land, his tractor, his stored grains, and even the money he has saved. All these things have value and can be used to satisfy his family's needs or to invest in his farm. The land can be sold if needed, the tractor can be used to produce more crops, and the grains can be consumed or sold in the market. Wealth can be categorized in several ways. First, individual wealth consists of all the tangible and intangible possessions of a person. Tangible possessions are things you can touch, like land, buildings, and bonds. Intangible possessions are things like copyrights or patents. For example, a farmer's individual wealth includes his land, his farm equipment, and any loans that are due to him from others. Social wealth, on the other hand, is wealth that's collectively used by all members of society. This includes public parks, roads, government colleges, and public transportation. These resources benefit everyone in the community. For instance, a rural road that connects farmers to the market is social wealth because it helps all farmers in the area transport their goods. Representative wealth is a bit different. It's wealth in the form of title deeds. For example, the deed to a piece of land represents the wealth that the land itself holds. National wealth is the total of all individual and social wealth in a country. This includes natural resources like rivers, mountains, and forests, as well as man-made assets. When calculating national wealth, we also have to subtract the nation's debts. So, if Nepal has valuable forests and minerals but also has debts from international loans, those debts are subtracted from the total wealth. Cosmopolitan wealth is a broader concept. It refers to the wealth of the entire world, which is the sum of all national wealth. Finally, negative wealth is about debts. If an individual or a nation owes more than they own, they have negative wealth. For example, if a farmer has taken a loan to buy new equipment but hasn't been able to repay it yet, that loan represents negative wealth until it's paid off. Alright, let's move on to consumption. Consumption is the direct use of goods and services to satisfy current wants. It's the process of using the utility of goods and services. For example, when you eat a meal, drive a tractor, or learn something new, you're consuming goods or services. Consumption is super important in economics because it's both the beginning and the end of all economic activities. It's what drives production. Producers make goods and services because they know consumers will use them. Without consumption, there would be no need for production. Let me ask you a question. Have you ever noticed how after a good harvest, farmers and traders start preparing more goods for the market? That's because they know people will consume those goods. Consumption signals to producers that there's demand, so they continue to produce. Consumption can be categorized in different ways. First, there's slow and fast consumption. Durable goods, like tractors or refrigerators, are consumed slowly over a long period. Perishable goods, like vegetables or dairy products, are consumed quickly because they spoil easily. Then we have direct and indirect consumption. Direct consumption is when you use a good or service immediately, like eating food or driving a car. Indirect consumption involves goods that are used up in the process of providing a service. For example, fuel is consumed indirectly when you drive a car. The fuel powers the car, but you don't use it directly like you use the car itself. There's also today's consumption and tomorrow's consumption. Today's consumption satisfies present needs, like eating a meal when you're hungry. Tomorrow's consumption is about saving or preserving resources for future use, like storing grains for the next season or planting trees that will provide fruit in the coming years. Consumption can also be of goods or services. Goods are physical things like food items, clothes, and vehicles. Services are activities performed by people, like teaching, healthcare, or tractor rental services. Let's talk about useful and wasteful consumption. Useful consumption is when goods and services are used in a way that provides some benefit. For example, using fertilizers to increase crop yield is useful because it helps produce more food. Wasteful consumption, on the other hand, is when goods are used excessively or without proper need. Overeating food or using too much medicine than prescribed are examples of wasteful consumption. It's important to distinguish between the two because useful consumption helps in development, while wasteful consumption leads to resource depletion and can even be harmful. Consumption can also be divided into individual and government consumption. Individual consumption is when people use goods and services to meet their personal needs. For example, when a farmer buys seeds for his farm or when a family buys food for their meals. Government consumption is when the government uses resources to meet the needs of the nation. This includes things like building roads, providing education, or investing in irrigation systems. Government consumption often aims at providing public goods and services that benefit everyone in the society. Finally, there's the consumption of consumers' goods and producers' goods. Consumers' goods are those that are directly used by consumers, like fruits, vegetables, and vehicles. Producers' goods are used in the production process, like inputs, seeds, fertilizers, and raw materials, wood, metal. Let me give you a quick example. A farmer uses fertilizers, a producer good, to grow wheat, a consumer good. The fertilizer is consumed in the production process, helping to increase the yield of wheat, which is then consumed by people as food. Alright, let's move on to production. Production is the process of creating utility. It's how we take raw materials and add value to them to make them more useful. For example, turning iron into tools or processing paddy into rice. Production isn't just about manufacturing things, it includes a wide range of activities that add utility. There are different ways to create utility in production. Form utility, changing the form of a good. For example, making tools from iron. Time utility, making a good available when it's needed, like storing apples during the harvest season and selling them later when they're scarce. Place utility, moving goods from where they're produced to where they're needed. Transporting apples from the hill regions to the Terai plains. Service utility, providing knowledge or training, like teaching farmers about new cultivation techniques. Possession utility, transferring ownership of goods. When a farmer sells his land to a real estate developer, the land's utility changes based on its new use. Knowledge utility, discovering new information or cultivars. For example, researching and developing a new variety of rice that's more resistant to pests. Let me share a quick story. There was a farmer who took raw bamboo, a raw material with limited utility, and turned it into bamboo mats, adding form utility. He then transported these mats to a city where there was high demand, adding place utility. By selling them during a local festival when the demand was highest, adding time utility, he was able to increase the value of his product significantly. Production is absolutely vital in economic activities. Without production, there would be no goods to consume. It's the foundation of our economy. Production also creates employment opportunities. When farmers produce crops, they might hire laborers to help with planting and harvesting. This provides income to those laborers, which they can then use to meet their own needs. Moreover, increased production can lead to the progress and development of a country. If Nepali farmers can produce more food efficiently, it not only feeds the population but can also be exported, earning foreign exchange for the country. This, in turn, can be invested in infrastructure, education, and other sectors, leading to overall development. Now, let's talk about equilibrium. Equilibrium is like a state of rest in economics. It's a situation where there's no tendency to change because everything is balanced. In the context of the market, equilibrium occurs when the amount consumers want to buy at a particular price is exactly the same as the amount producers are willing to sell at that price. Imagine you're at a local vegetable market. If vendors are selling tomatoes at 50 rupees per kilo, and consumers are buying exactly the number of tomatoes the vendors have brought to the market at that price, then we're in equilibrium. There's no reason for vendors to change their price or for consumers to buy more or less, at least not until some other factor changes. Market equilibrium is a crucial concept. It's the point where the demand curve intersects the supply curve. At this point, there's no incentive for producers or consumers to change their behavior because they're both satisfied with the current price and quantity. But here's the thing, equilibrium isn't static. It can change based on various factors. For example, if there's a sudden increase in the demand for maize because a new food processing factory starts buying it, the equilibrium price and quantity will change. Producers will be willing to supply more maize at higher prices, and consumers, in this case, the factory, will be willing to buy more at those prices until a new equilibrium is reached. Alright, let's explore the concept of margin. Margin refers to the additional changes in outputs that result from changes in inputs. It's about looking at the current level of consumption or production of a good or service and understanding how small changes can affect the overall outcome. For example, if a farmer adds one more unit of fertilizer to his field, the margin would be the additional change in crop yield resulting from that extra fertilizer. It helps us understand whether adding more of something is worth it or if it's diminishing returns. There are several marginal concepts in economics that are central to understanding how decisions are made. The theory of marginalism suggests that economic decisions are based on incremental units at the margin. This means that when deciding whether to produce or consume one more unit of a good, we consider the marginal utility or marginal cost associated with it. Marginal cost is the change in total cost that comes from producing one additional unit of a good or service. It includes all the variable costs that change with the level of production. For example, if a farmer is producing maize and decides to plant an extra hectare, the marginal cost would include the cost of additional seeds, fertilizers, and labor needed for that hectare. Let me give you a quick example. Suppose it costs a farmer 1,000 rupees to produce 100 kilograms of maize. If he decides to produce an additional 10 kilograms, and it costs him an extra 150 rupees for seeds, fertilizers, and labor, then the marginal cost of producing that extra 10 kilograms is 150 rupees. Marginal utility is the additional satisfaction or benefit a consumer gets from consuming one more unit of a good or service. It can be positive, negative, or zero. For example, if you're thirsty, the first glass of water gives you high marginal utility. The second glass might still be good but with lower marginal utility. By the third or fourth glass, the marginal utility might become zero or even negative if you start feeling uncomfortable. Let me ask you a question. Have you ever eaten too many chocolates? The first few might taste great, but after a while, you might not enjoy them as much, or you might even feel sick. That's diminishing marginal utility in action. The marginal rate of substitution is the rate at which a consumer is willing to exchange one good for another while maintaining the same level of satisfaction. For example, a consumer might be willing to give up 2 apples to get 1 orange if that's what it takes to keep them equally satisfied. In farming, this could be like a farmer deciding how much maize he's willing to give up to get an extra bag of fertilizers, depending on how valuable each is to his production. The concept of margin is incredibly important in economics. It helps us understand how prices are determined. From the demand side, prices are influenced by marginal utility, how much satisfaction consumers get from an additional unit of a good. From the supply side, prices are influenced by marginal cost, how much it costs producers to make one more unit. This concept is also key in theories of perfect competition, consumer demand, and firm behavior. It helps businesses decide how much to produce and helps consumers decide how much to buy. In microeconomics, the marginal concept plays a special role in price theory. The idea is that the value of a good is determined by its marginal utility and marginal cost. If the marginal utility of a good is higher than its marginal cost, consumers will be willing to buy more of it. Conversely, if the marginal cost is higher than the marginal utility, consumers might buy less. This balance between marginal utility and marginal cost helps determine the equilibrium price in the market. It's a fundamental principle that helps us understand how markets work and how resources are allocated efficiently. And that's it for today's lesson. I hope this overview of basic economic concepts has been helpful. Remember, these concepts are the building blocks for understanding more complex topics.